Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar with me, Duncan Crawford. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're discussing high stakes exams and assessments. End of year tests like A-levels and baccalaureates, as well as coursework and teacher assessments, have a huge impact on young people's lives. The outcomes of these tests and assessments are huge. If students do well, doors are opened. If they do poorly, then some doors might be closed to them. But are high stakes exams and assessments still fit for purpose? Well, today we're going to debate that question, and we're also going to hear about the findings from a new OECD report called The Theory and Practice of Upper Secondary Certification. We're going to have a panel discussion about that in a moment's time. But before that, let's hear from the OECD's analyst, Rebecca Frankham, who's going to give us an overview of the main findings of that new report, which is out today. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Duncan. I should be unmuted now. Perfect. So while I just get my slides up, here we go. Brilliant. So my name's Rebecca, and I'll be giving a quick introduction before we get into the panel discussion. So this is on our new report, which is coming out today on the theory and practice of upper secondary certification. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and to engage with you all on the question of the relevancy of high stakes assessment, exams, and upper secondary certificates. Completing secondary school and achieving an upper secondary certificate is an important milestone for all learners. An upper secondary certificate represents the culmination of tens of thousands of hours of learning, from primary school right through to when learners are right on the cusp of adulthood. In most countries, learners use their upper secondary certificates and results to apply to higher education, to further vocational education and training, and to put on their CVs for applying for jobs. In short, upper secondary certificates matter deeply to young people and to societies. These certificates and the assessments and exams underpinning them carry stakes for learners, and so it is important that they are perceived to be fair. Students need to be given equal opportunity to show what they know and can do. Assessment needs to be inclusive, without bias, so that all learners can participate. To be credible, results need to mean something. The results of a student from one school should be able to be compared with that of a student from another. Higher education institutions should be able to look at results and know which students have the right foundations to enter their programs. Upper secondary certificates need to be relevant to learners and to the world around them. And not just for today's world, but also that of tomorrow. And importantly, upper secondary certification needs to be manageable. Students spend so much of their lives at school, studying, doing homework, revising. It needs to be achievable to get a certificate and still have a life without burning out. These are 4 principles of upper secondary certification that we identify in our new report. Here at the OECD, we decided to do this analysis on upper secondary assessment because often discussions and debates on this topic can become very heated very quickly, to say the least. So some people think that exams are archaic and outdated. Others think that they're the only assessment method that can be trusted, especially today with the rise of AI. Some people think that teacher-based assessment should be the main form of assessment, while others think that exams are the most reliable and fair way to assess students. With this report, we wanted to step beyond the noise and take a proper look at these issues. Our report is an evidence-based overview of upper secondary certification, including an analysis of 71 certificates across 38 systems. To develop the report, we've had lengthy conversations with policymakers across these systems about why their upper secondary certificates, their exams, their assessments are designed the way that they are, and also what direction they're heading in for the future. So to help me set up this panel discussion, I have 3 ideas from our new report that I want to share. Firstly, don't get rid of exams just yet. So exams can be used to assess a range of complex skills, processes, and knowledges. Exams can be designed in such a way that it's not going to be enough to get a good grade if you just memorize your answer. By presenting students with complex problems to solve or tasks where they have to think strategically about the best possible answer, students have to demonstrate skills like analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Digital exams can also include a range of multimedia materials like animations, short films, and audio recordings, all of which can provide ways to bring authentic, real-world sources and debates into assessment. In exams, students can be asked to critically reflect on an issue or to make connections between their own experiences and source material used in the paper. To give an example, in our report, one of the sample tasks that we look at is a national language exam where students have to analyse the rhetorical devices of a political speech. A key function of upper secondary certification is to act as a passport for students as they progress on their pathway. For many students, the next step on their journey is higher education. Across the OECD, about 40% of upper secondary graduates enroll in higher education by age 20, and almost 50% of 25 to 34-year-olds have completed tertiary education. Upper secondary certification plays a crucial role at this transition point. It needs to signal that learners have the skills and knowledge needed to enter higher education. And when programs and places are limited, it needs to enable higher education to sort out which students to give those places to. And this is one of the reasons why exams are still important. Higher education institutions need to be able to make fair comparisons of students. And this is easier to do when they know that students wrote the same exams, that exams are set at a consistent standard of difficulty year on year, that a consistent marking process was applied, and that students sat exams under the same conditions and students who need accessibility accommodations are able to access these. Our analysis finds that when students sit tests or exams, these tend to be delivered under what we call strictly controlled exam conditions, frequently at the end of the learning program. And these tests or exams are most often externally set by a national or central agency, and then they're also frequently marked or graded by this agency as well. But of course, it's not all about exams, and it's important to include other assessments beyond exams as well. Modern curricula tend to focus on many different skills. Young people today need strong critical thinking skills, they need to be effective communicators, they need to be able to work in teams. And they need to be able to show and really demonstrate that they can put these skills into practice. As the world of work evolves, young people need to be adaptable and resilient and ready to reskill and upskill. Different assessment approaches like collecting naturally occurring evidence, project and portfolio-based assessment, and practical activities and performances can all provide ways for learners to showcase these diverse skills. And frequently, these types of assessments tend to most often be delivered as teacher-based assessment. So the majority of certificates that we analysed included a teacher-based component in the requirements for certification alongside external exams. For example, in France, 40% of learners' grades come from contrôle continu and 60% comes from final exams. Teacher-based assessment can be a way to ensure that assessment stays close to day-to-day learning, the curriculum that students experience in the classroom. Through diverse and creative assessment tasks, upper secondary certificates can recognise a range of skills, including those that matter most to societies. The perceived negative consequences of exams on student well-being are a major concern for parents and policymakers. However, using the PISA Index of Mathematics Anxiety, our analysis finds no significant relationship between the share of students taking exams in a system and students' mathematics anxiety. There are some caveats to this analysis. Firstly, when we did this analysis, it's specific to mathematics anxiety, so not to general anxiety. And also, PISA is an international assessment of students at age 15, which is an age when not all students are necessarily sitting exams or beginning to think seriously about exams. However, despite these caveats with the analysis, we wanted to share this finding with you that there's no significant relationship between the share of students taking exams and mathematics anxiety in order to add another perspective to discussions and debates about the impact of exams on student mental well-being. We've also heard from conversations with students, teachers, and policymakers across different systems that students can also get stressed and anxious from other kinds of high-stakes assessments. For example, coursework or portfolios, especially when these happen continuously throughout the year or require a lot of time and effort. These can also affect students' well-being. I know we're all excited to hear from our other panelists, so I'll end there. But as I hope my presentation has shown, discussions and debates about exams and upper secondary certificates are deeply nuanced and complex. If this is a topic that interests you, please do ask questions in the chat and get in touch with us to have further discussions about our work.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Very interesting indeed. And I see there's lots of activity on the chat going on, dozens and dozens of messages. Lots of people saying hello. Hello to Pamela from London, Marlin from Sweden, Judy from Ireland, Mazakuzo from Japan, Harry from New York, and so on and so on. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this. As you were hearing, lots of stuff to discuss. So instead of me rabbiting on, why don't we bring our panel into this discussion? Joining us on the panel today, Jan Kontinen, Director of Education at the Swedish National Agency for Education. Ellen Thompson, General Inspector of Education, Sport and Research for the French Ministries of Education, Sport and Research. And Dr. Lena Gray, independent assessment researcher who worked on the new OECD report, actually, which we've just been discussing, and previously spent more than 2 decades working for the Scottish Qualifications Authority. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this webinar today. Great to see you. If people on the chat want to send a question to any of the members of our panel, then please do. You're already writing in the chat, so write in your questions, and I'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Right now, let's kick things off though. Ellen Thompson, I'm going to come to you first, if you don't mind. France, I understand it's reformed the baccalaureate to reduce the weight of the final exams, high stakes exams, and it's increased the amount of continuous assessment. Is that showing that final exams in France are becoming less relevant to education?
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, I am going to talk about the French baccalaureate. For those that don't know what that is, it's the final assessment at the end of upper secondary, also known as the bac. But I'd also like to reflect on how these changes relate to the French higher admission platform, because Rebecca has just mentioned that. Yeah, going back on what you just said, the bac has undergone major changes over the last few years. The main reform being basically a new structure. Previously, the exam was based almost entirely on final written exams taken at the end of the last year of upper secondary school. Basically, in France, every student, I was one of them, used to sit down at the same time on the same day and was asked the same question per subject. So that's been reformed since 2019. And today the bac is now based on a combination of final exams still in 2 or 3 subjects, but also continuous assessment. Basically now the final exams represent 60% of the final grade, whereas continuous assessment represents 40%. The continuous assessment that we have in France is based on grades from the students' work during the last 2 years of upper secondary. So we use their school reports and a few selected tests, bringing in basically, just as Rebecca mentioned, a range of sources, problem solving, teamwork. While this was going on, so changing the way we assessed, another major change was also the disappearance of what we called the traditional mainstreams. We had a general bac, a scientific bac, and an economic and social studies bac. As we changed the way of assessment, we also changed this mainstreaming. And so instead of being placed in a fixed stream, students now have one common core, and they choose 3 speciality subjects in their second year of upper secondary. And they can then keep 2 of these specialities in their final year. And this system was put in place basically to give students more freedom, and allow them to build a personalized pathway. I like calling it that. Basically, they could mix maths if they wanted to with literary subjects. In theory, this gave students a lot more freedom to build a personalized path and prevent what we used to call the elite all going into scientific studies. What the reform also introduced was a new oral exam. So the assessment that every student still has to take at the end of the year now is called the Grand Oral. And in this exam, students must present a project linked to their speciality subject and answer questions from a jury. This goal obviously is to develop oral skills, but also self-confidence, the ability to argue clearly, which are essential skills for higher education and professional life. As I said a little bit in my introduction, and to reflect back on what Rebecca said, these changes are really closely linked to what we call Parcoursup, which is the national platform for higher education admissions. Parcoursup now relies heavily on these students' school reports for 2 years of continuous assessment grades, and the applications are submitted now before the final back results are released. So now higher education in France, for their selection and their admissions, do not have access to the final results. They have to pass the back, but the high stakes don't actually get to see their results. They just know that they've passed it, but they have the results from the past, basically 2 years. And this means that students' performance throughout upper secondary school, including their speciality subjects and their participation in assessments, directly affects their chances of being admitted to universities and other higher education programs. Basically, what we've aimed to do is make the exam more progressive, better suited to students' future studies. We also sought to reduce basically structural bias by rebalancing assessment and increasing transparency in access to higher education. The old system basically relied almost entirely on high-stakes final exams, competitive testing, whereas the new baccalaureate introduced a significant share of continuous assessment, reducing the dominance of that one-shot examination. And at the same time, the Parcoursup platform now requires university to clearly state what expected specialities and skills they expect for their admissions. Clearly, this did not eliminate selection. And sometimes people will say that it's made long-standing biases more visible and less implicit. But maybe we'll go on to that later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that. So I think a very thorough description of what's been going on in France. And let's get a different perspective from Sweden, where, correct me if I'm wrong, Jan Kontinen, is it almost the reverse? Because in Sweden, it's been more focused on teacher-based assessments, but now you're moving towards introducing national exams. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. If I talk a little bit first about today's system, then in today's system in Sweden, upper secondary certification is decided 100% from teacher grades. We have national tests, but their function is only to support the teachers in their grading decision. There is, of course, on the side also SWISAT test that tests proficiency for higher education, but that is not connected to the curriculum in upper secondary education. So in upper secondary education, the certification is 100% from teacher grades. And teacher grading, of course, has its advantages and strengths. Teacher grading can consider skills that are difficult to measure in a test that only takes a few hours. Teacher grading can consider all achievements of the students in the whole course of the whole year. Teacher grading can compensate for groups that has disadvantage in external tests, for example, for accessibility or language reasons. So we see the strengths in the teacher grading as a big part of certification, but we also have some problems then in our system today. We have a serious problem with the level of grading between schools being unfair. It's considerably easier to get higher grades in some schools compared to other schools, because we don't have that objective national test that sets the standards between the schools. And that has become a significant problem the last 10 years. So there has been a national inquiry that comes with a proposition, and that is on the way. We have gotten the mission to start preparing for these new changes, but they haven't happened yet. But this proposition, it proposes that we will introduce new national final exams with a function to calibrate the grading level between the schools. So if a school's teachers sets too high grades compared to the national final exams, then their merit value will be lowered in the calibrating process. And of course, the opposite. If the students in the school are having a higher results in the national test compared to the teacher grading, then the merit value will be taken up in the merit value. So we are going the other way than France. We are introducing a national test that has a stronger function that we have had earlier, but maybe we are anyway going a little bit to the same position, because we come from different extremes. So we are the extreme that only has had the teacher grading as a certification. I mean, France, it has been the tests that have been the main base for the certification, and we're both maybe closing into the middle.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I was going to ask if these reforms are addressing similar challenges, but just coming at them from opposite directions. Dr. Lena Gray, it's a good time to bring you in. You helped write the report. What trends are you observing internationally? Are countries moving in the same direction, or are they diverging in this area?
That's a really good question. And I think what we've seen here in these two examples really kind of sums up what you see in different systems around the world, that there's almost a kind of consideration of similar issues, but because the response has to be context specific, the actual action that's considered to be the right way to address those issues is going to be different in different countries. And indeed, the report does sort of cite the examples, again, like France and Sweden, current reforms in Scotland and New Zealand, where in Scotland, the government has just announced that they want to introduce more teacher-based assessment, more classroom and coursework-based assessment, and have lesser reliance on exams. Whereas in New Zealand, where there has been a lot of coursework and classroom and teacher-based assessment for a number of years, the government has just announced that they would like to see more exams.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we may have lost, sadly, Dr. Lena Gray midway through. She's back again. Lena, apologies, I'm interrupting because we lost your feed for quite a while.
Oh, sorry about that.
I wasn't sure if you were still with us or if you'd lost connection. Please carry on.
So what I was saying was, while countries appear to be moving in different directions, either lessening their focus on exams or increasing it, often they're responding to the same sets of issues, the ones that Rebecca outlined. And that includes, for me, a kind of key one I'm seeing a lot is this discussion about a broader curriculum, whether called 21st century skills, global competencies, social and emotional skills, looking for ways to include things.
Oh dear, there seems to be a few gremlins in the system, I'm afraid, for Dr. Lena Gray. Let's bring in the OECD's very own Rebecca Frankham to take over. Rebecca, we heard some of what Lena was trying to say there before she unfortunately got cut off. There are lots of questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to give you one of them, Angela from the Ontario Ministry of Education, who says, how can systems certify learning and readiness without relying on high stakes exams?
Thanks, Duncan. And I think that the examples that we've seen already from Sweden and France give some illustration of what that can look like in practice with a combination of exams and other assessment methods. And I think even within that, there's still a real range of practice, and often that looks like the role of teachers being prominent within that certification process. You know, exams are traditionally something which is standardized. All students are tending to normally accessing the same papers. And so there's a real central role there for central authorities to develop those papers, to take them back and then mark them. But when we see different formats, different types of assessments being included, that's often bringing in the role of teachers, whether that is, you know, what might be called teacher-based assessment, it might be called coursework, there might even be, you know, specific projects or portfolios or specific assessment tasks that students are working towards, but often that more closely integrates the role of teachers and can also enable more flexibility for that assessment to be maybe tailored to a specific local curriculum context, or to be you know, tailored to students' specific interests and such as that. So often there's a combination of assessment occurring within upper secondary certificates. So exams still tend to have an important weight, and they might even be looked at more closely at that higher education transition. You know, higher education institutions sometimes might give more weight to them, but broadly within certificates overall, what we're seeing is a combination of assessment methods being used to displace that traditional focus, which might have exclusively been on exams in some systems.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. And I know behind the scenes we're working to get Lena back with us with a decent internet connection. To move things on, I want to talk about what upper secondary certifications are really for. Are they about celebrating what students can do, or are they more about helping decide who gets into higher education and beyond? Ellen Thompson, how would you categorize the French system in this regard?
Well, I would say that now basically the main goal of this continuous assessment that we've brought in is to better recognize the students' skills. Unlike one single final exam, it allows the teachers to evaluate students over time. And this means that not only is there sort of like testing evaluated, but the fact that they work regularly means we can evaluate progress. I'm a big advocate of evaluating progress, evaluate effort, evaluate consistency. All this is taken into account. And for many students, this system is less stressful and gives a fairer picture of their abilities. It also evaluates, I'd say, values, anyway, a wider range of skills, because we don't only focus on academic knowledge, but also on organization, on participation, on long-term commitment. And in this sense, it helps recognize students who may not perform just as well under that exam pressure, but are serious and motivated throughout the whole year. And in our case, throughout 2 whole years. For example, also in our vocational baccalaureate and technological baccalaureate that we have, exams are designed to evaluate and assess practical and applied skills and not only theory. Therefore, we have laboratory work, we have technical tasks, we have workshops, oral exams where students explain how, why they did something, problem-solving tasks based on real workplace situations, and maybe we'll come back to that later on. But this shows also technical skills, this shows methodology, this shows professional reasoning for some of our students. This continuous assessment plays a key role in the selection process for higher education. I saw there were quite a few questions in the chat about the higher education access. Since students apply to universities before they have their final bac results, as I said earlier, the admissions decisions are mainly based on school reports and teachers' evaluations. As a result, it's this continuous assessment, not only of knowledge, but also of skills, that has become a central tool for selecting students. I won't shy away from the question that has this situation raised a bit of criticism? Yes, it has. Some people will argue that continuous assessment increases pressure throughout the year and can create inequalities between schools. because as we all know, grading standards may vary between schools, even between teachers in the same schools. And a lot of people in France now feel that Parcoursup, the admission system, has more importance than the final exam itself. But is that a bad thing? So basically, continuous assessment was introduced to improve the recognition of the students' skills, but it also facilitates selection for higher education. So basically, it plays a double role in France.
Thank you for that, Ellen. Just to clarify on one point, because Loretta has written in asking, how are graduation results used for admission in higher education institutions in France?
In France, it's quite simple. As I said, the 2 years of their student card reports are sent up through this machine called Parcoursup, which is just an application. It's a bit like a meetic, they say in France, between those that want to go in and those that want to select them. But the fact that the actual back isn't taken into account, the only factor which is taken into account is, have they passed or have they failed their back at the end of the year? That's the only thing that the basically higher education institutions will know. They've passed, so they can go in. If they haven't passed, they can't get in, but they will be selected before they know, even if they have their back or not.
Thank you so much. Let's bring in Jan Kontinen again to get the perspective of Sweden. There's a question from Brian from the Da Vinci Institute who's asking about oral examinations and whether they can ever be used as the sole basis for assessment. And I don't know what the situation is in Sweden. Do you use oral assessment regularly or not?
With all assessment? What does you mean by that?
As in the sole, but as in you'd only have an oral examination to assess students and their abilities.
Well, basically, the assessment is a teacher grading, and teacher grading takes into account everything a student makes in a year, and that will be up to the teacher, how the teacher decides to have different types of examinations, or no examinations, or it's a highly teacher. You have a lot of trust in the teacher in this Swedish system.
We might move on, and I can see. I'm going to turn to you, Rebecca Franken from the OECD, because we are having some technical problems. There's a question from Iona from Vilnius Gediminas Technical University. Apologies for the pronunciation there. Who asks, how can you ensure an objective nationwide assessment of students' competencies? How can you ensure they are objective?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Duncan. When we're talking about student competencies, they can mean a lot of different things. Even as policymakers, as researchers, when we're talking about 21st century skills, competencies, half the time we're not even talking about the same thing. So it can be quite hard to, have a universal language around what we mean. Even harder sometimes it can be to find, valid, reliable ways to assess these competencies. While they're really important skills and competencies, and we frequently see them being included in countries' curricula, it's much harder for countries to find ways to include them within high stakes assessment. And it's even a discussion and a debate, should they be included in high stakes assessment? On the one hand, upper secondary certification should be something that reflects the breadth of what learners have studied and engaged with. It should be a recognition of their achievement over the course of their schooling career. On the other hand, not everything that learners have done, not everything that they've engaged with needs to be assessed. And there are, very valid arguments that if we assess everything, that has a washback effect on the curriculum, that can have pernicious effects, in the way that teaching and learning occurs. What I find really interesting is where there's practice that we're seeing emerge, where countries are finding innovative ways to bring, skills and competencies into assessment that doesn't necessarily distort what's going on. So, there are some really interesting examples where students might have to do a project in a way that demonstrates these skills and competencies, but maybe it's not graded or it doesn't go into their final, score. Maybe it's a mandatory thing that they have to do, so it's ensuring that they're engaging with it, that they're maybe doing this project that's community-based or, doing these things which develop their skills. but it might not necessarily have that same role in their, final average GPA or something like that. Or another example that we're seeing is where there might be some self-evaluation. So students might have to critically reflect, do some meta thinking about their own learning to learn skills, where they might do an assessment or do a test and then reflect on it afterwards. How did it go? What could they have done better? So there are all sorts of ways that countries, I think, are beginning to bring the assessment of these skills into their assessment frameworks and thinking, without necessarily putting the high stakes on them that could create issues.
I'm glad to say that Ellen Thompson is still with us. And in France, Ellen, you have the baccalaureate, as you've been explaining, but you also have the professional baccalaureate and other kinds of vocational qualifications. What kind of skills do these vocational programs assess, and how do they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. All the baccalaureate, maybe I'll just go back on a point that I said in the first point, just to have a grand oral, which was introduced as part of the recent bac reform. So we have one part where all students, whether they're vocational, technical, or general, must present a project linked to their speciality subject and respond to those questions that we talked about from a jury. So that's one part of it. But the other example that you just mentioned is the vocational baccalaureate, which has long relied, I'd say, on alternative forms of assessment. Students in vocational tracts are evaluated through practical exams, continuous assessment, and periods of work placement in companies. These evaluations allow teachers and examiners to assess real professional skills, such as teamwork, technical competencies, and adaptability, rather than only theoretical knowledge. I'll give you an example. I'm getting into the nitty-gritty here, but for an example, maybe I can go on to sort of like somebody who's in electricity. Let's take that example. An electricity vocational sort of training. First of all, he's going to have practical exams where in a workshop, he's going to have to basically wire up something. He'll be given a list of material, and students will be evaluated not only on this project and this practical assignment, but also by their ability to apply the knowledge, also is evaluated on safety, on quality procedures, on communication, on professional behavior. So this will all be done as a sort of like professional project, and then they'll have to defend it in front of a jury. But also throughout the year, seeing as the students will have roughly 8 weeks placement in a company, they will also be evaluated by a professional employer who will send feedback back to the school to say, yeah, as a professional, this student knows how to arrive on time, to be dressed correctly for the work that he has to do, etc., etc. So we're really bringing in something different. This example shows that we're really trying to increase recognizing that academic success cannot be measured only through written tests, and we need to diversify evaluating methods, especially on something where in everyday life, these students are then going to become professionals and working in our houses or in restaurants or wherever. And we need these evaluations to reflect on the students' abilities and prepare them also for real world situations. Basically, moving beyond these written exams allows a fairer and more complete assessment, I think, of students and recognizing a wider range of skills.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lena Gray, I think you can hear me, and I hope your camera is still working. You are. Fantastic. A question here from Carmel from St. Martin's Institute of Higher Education. She asked, from a national policy framework perspective, are there any tangible case studies to benchmark teacher assessments across different regions?
Thank you, Duncan. That is a really interesting question. If we're thinking about benchmarking within a national system, then yes, there are many systems who have found, or at least are trying, ways to do that. And I think some of the most powerful we see in systems like Queensland and Australia, where what is used can at least partially or wholly be called a kind of social moderation or a community of practice, where teachers who are making the judgment, sometimes supported by professionals, sometimes supported by employers if it's a vocational area that's been assessed, but it's about those teachers and other interested stakeholders coming together to discuss what makes an appropriate performance in that particular assessment. And that discussion, I think, is a very powerful tool for allowing standardisation. And I think for me, it's partly about thinking of assessment in a slightly different way, that it's not about measuring a quantity that therefore we can get right or wrong, but it's more about judging a set of qualities, and therefore social moderation, discussing with other professionals, is a really useful way to standardise.
Thank you so much for that. Let's bring back in Jan Kontinen. I wanted to ask a question from Mohammed from Libya, who asked, how can employers and businesses be involved in assessment processes? There's been a number of questions actually about how business and industries can get involved in evaluating students. What do you say to that?
Well, in Sweden, our agency who are setting the national curriculum, we have basically systematic meetings with the different branches of industry and different economic branches. And in those, of course, they can have influence on what kind of competencies they see as important to get into the curriculum. Also, they can have influence on what kind of competencies we should have in the grading criteria, because in Sweden, because it's teacher grading, deciding the actual certification, then every subject has the same value. Also, the vocational subject has the same value as a theoretical subject. So then you can say they have the direct influence on the certification through influence in the curriculum, both in the marking criteria, the grading criteria, and the content. So by having an active contact, then the different branches of industry get direct influence. And in our system, they get a rather strong influence because the certification is made by the teacher grading. And we also have our vocational programs, study programs. All the vocational study programs give access to higher education certification. The students have possibility to take away a few theoretical subjects if they don't want to read as theoretical, but they are included from the beginning in their study program, also in the vocational program. So basically, all students who read at upper secondary level in Sweden, if they fulfill the basic program, have basic access to higher education. They get the certifications for it. But of course, many students also take away some of the theoretical subjects, so all don't get certified for higher education.
Thank you so much. On the subject of businesses and employers, Ellen Thompson, a question from Walter Patterson, who says, are employers offering places also given training in the evaluation of student performance? Is there a danger of bias?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And we've just reformed our vocational, basically schools in France. And that was one of the big points which was raised during the construction of all these reforms. It's placement is obligatory in France, so the students have to go into these internships, and yet the employers that welcome into their businesses the students are not always as well trained as we would like. And so for me, that is really something that we need to carry on encouraging and that we need to perform better on. Today, basically, what we have is the students going in for their 8 weeks in their final year upper secondary to do an internship, and they will have an employer evaluation. So the employer will evaluate the students' professional skills, they'll assess behavior, they'll fill in an official evaluation form, and so that's mandatory, and it's the same all over France. But I'd say where we could perform better is maybe preparing these employers a little bit so that the co-evaluation that they're actually giving with the teachers is more standardized. What we also have, and I didn't mention, is on the exam boards, we have professional juries. So basically we have employers sitting on the exam jury alongside the teachers and training staff. And this applies to all our vocational certificates, whether it's the CAP, the BAC Pro, everything. And this really is to ensure their role of making sure that skills match real labour market needs. They validate the final results with the teachers and sometimes decide with the teachers whether it's a pass or a fail. So yeah, I'd say they're really involved. And before all that, they also influence our program design. Beyond individual students, employers in France help define the training standards, and they contribute to our certification frameworks. So yeah, they have quite a big role in vocational education in France.
Thank you for that. Dr. Lena Gray, on the subject of this, how do you ensure that businesses' evaluation methods are comparable and how they compared across countries?
Oh, compared across countries is a very difficult thing to do, as Ellen has said, and as Walter Patterson's question suggests. Most employers are not assessment experts, and if they were, or they could field somebody who was, they're likely to be in very big companies. So if you want a representation of different sorts of employers, you have to accept that employers should be involved in any assessment system with support with others through things like boards and juries and different groups that allow them to input, whether that's at the design stage or later at the judgment and marking stage, but allow them to input with the help of teachers, of assessment experts, and with others around them, because employers have their business to run. And really, teaching and assessment is the business of another set of professionals, the teachers and the assessment professionals within that system. And then when you can get that in a system, you can look to share that across countries, and you can look to compare your standards and to take part in different sort of projects that help you to do that.
Thank you so much for that. A different subject which a few people have been writing in about is AI. And Rakesh has just sent in a question saying teacher grading with continuous assessment requires a lot more work for teachers and with teachers under a lot more stress. What is the panelist view of using AI to help teachers assess faster with lesser errors while keeping in mind inclusivity and equity? Who'd like to have a go at that one? Perhaps Ellen.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that we're one of the advanced countries on that, but I'd say AI is starting to appear in the French education grading. It's very controlled, it's very limited. We've even sort of like brought out a national text about using AI in the French education system. We're very cautious about this in France at the moment. But for the moment, AI can be used, obviously, for correcting multiple choice questions, language exercises, grammar, spelling, mostly used as support tools, not really final decision makers. AI helps teachers as sort of like an assistive tool as well, pre-correcting assignments, I think, detecting maybe patterns of errors and suggesting feedback comments, things like that. But also, and then it is used a lot for that, for flagging plagiarism or AI-generated work. A human teacher always validates the grade in France for the moment. So I'd say that's where we are. We're certainly not at the moment at all on fully automated grading of anything, even including essays. It's more of a tool, and we have legal and ethical rules which have just been brought out in a national paper.
Yeah, and if I can bring you in on this, because obviously it's teacher assessments, there's lots of coursework in Sweden. So how big a danger is it that AI is being used by students more regularly now and that that's not being picked up? Is that a concern?
Yes, it has definitely been a concern that has become bigger the last couple of years. And our agency is giving advice to the schools on how to deal with this situation, and we are basically recommending the schools to not do as much assessing in the home anymore. So don't give assignments that the students write at home. If it's an important assignment, then they should normally do it in a more controlled circumstances. But of course, for other assignments that are not so high stakes for the teacher, they can of course let them do home also. But it will be at the end up to the teacher, and we know they will do it differently in our system. But we are giving the advice to be cautious about these questions. But of course, they should also be able to use it, the students, in assignments. But if you wanna investigate their knowledge in a subject, then it probably should be in a more controlled environment. For the national test system, we are more in the same situation as France there, that we are maybe not the forerunners in this question. But we see that it will be a future. It will come, but we are not the front line in AI in assessment in national tests or in item construction.
Okay, good to know. OECD analyst Rebecca Frankham, if I can bring you in on this, there's a question related from James Michael Walker. So who asks, how are Gen AI tools revolutionizing assessment, if indeed are they?
Yeah, that's a really big question. So, as we've kind of touched on between Alan's responses and Jan's, is that there's two facets that we're talking about here. We're talking about AI, when and how it's being used by teachers or by assessors, by examination agencies. And then we're also talking about AI and the extent to which it is being used by students when they're preparing, their coursework, their projects, their homework. So these are two, complementary conversations and dialogues, which I think are going on at the same time. In terms of how it's revolutionizing, that's a very big question. I think we'd have to get a young person on here to tell us how they're using it. But I think the main thing to remember is, what is the construct that's being assessed? And like Jan said, if you're wanting to assess, students' knowledge recall, you're wanting to assess their ability in set conditions to do a particular thing, like write an essay or respond to these questions, then you're probably wanting to do that in controlled conditions where you know that students aren't accessing anything else except their own memory, their own pen and paper, or their fingers on the keyboard to do the thing that they need to do. So that's one thing. But then there's also a world in which, it's totally valid to want to put assessment into real world context and say to students, with all the resources available to you, go away and do this thing, see what you can come up with and make it as good as you can. That might be some project, that might be, a technology, it might be a new product that they're developing. And there might be very valid scenarios in which it's appropriate to draw on AI. But I think what's really important to remember is that this isn't a new conversation. I'm sure this conversation was had when the internet first became a big thing, when students first discovered Wikipedia. It's bigger, it's a bigger conversation because, AI is big. But I think it's important that remember that we're not having this conversation for the first time either.
Thank you so much for that. Would you like to come on this, Dr. Lena Gray? I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I am by no means an expert on AI, but one thing that I would add here is the other aspect that it brings, or the other set of questions, is around that question of what does the curriculum need to cover? Because in a world where AI can be so easily accessed, and indeed where we have to be able to judge what different media, social media, and so on are telling us, then it suggests that young people need to have a deeper ability to critically analyse everything that they are interacting with, to try and work out whether the sources that they are finding are accurate ones and ones that they should use. So it's kind of telling us that there's another set of skills that we need to make sure our young people have, and we will need to assess those skills at some point. So it's bringing us back again to those broad transferable skills. And indeed, I think when I've engaged with employers, one of the things they've told me is that it's those broad skills of analysing and communicating the results of that analysis that they think that AI will never replace, or at least not in what they can currently see, that human aspect of judgment becomes more key in both the curriculum and in how we assess that.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you so much for that, Lena. We are running quite low on time now, and I want to thank everyone for sending in all their comments and questions. We obviously haven't had time to go through even a fraction of them. I want to ask one last question for each of our members of the panel. I'm probably tempting fate, Lena, by saying, look, your web connection's working fine now, so fingers crossed it lasts for the next 5 minutes or so. But the final question, I'll start, I think, with Jan Kontinen. If you could give one piece of advice to a country considering redesigning its upper secondary qualifications, what piece of advice would that be?
Well, I would say that you need at least 2 different ingredients in your certification. One ingredients that takes into account the fairness of the certification in a more objective way, like national tests are made in many countries, and that has to focus a lot on precision, reliability, but that needs to be complemented by something else. For example, teacher grading that can then take into account the other fairness questions of equity and inclusivity and so on. So I would say you need both parts, and also that it can be a risk if you start taking the national tests and try to make them, rich in measurement. There can be a risk that you lose the reliability and the precision in the measurement, and then it's probably not worth it, because then you risk getting in the Swedish situation today. So, keep the tests for what they are good for, and have another ingredient to get the equity, inclusivity, fairness.
Thank you so much. Ellen, what piece of advice would you give to a country redesigning its upper secondary qualifications?
Well, I think a little bit along the same lines. I'd say make sure you build a hybrid system. Make sure you've got at some point some clear standardized final exam to guarantee fairness and trust, but also embed continuous skills, continuous assessment, skills-based assessment, which is going to be validated by teachers and employers, so that the exams measure what learners can actually do and not just what that they can memorize. And if you do this, then make sure that you bring the support needed to the teachers and to the employers, so that there's still some sort of fairness in those assessments as well.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Lena Gray, your views on this?
Thanks, Duncan. I'm going to come back to the report because I entirely agree with Jan and Ellen that there's no simple solution, and it has to be about balance and possibly hybrid and mixed systems. The report suggests 4 principles that policymakers can use if they are reviewing their upper secondary certification. And we've talked a lot about fairness, and we've talked a lot about credibility. Those are 2 of the principles. But the other 2 that it talks about are relevance to progression pathways for the young people, and that's obviously concerned with what is covered. The one we've maybe not spoken so much about is manageability. And the report does suggest that often that's one that's missed out of considerations. And if you do miss it out, some countries, and I'm sure some participants here, can attest to the fact that that's when your reform might fall over.
Thank you so much. And Rebecca Frankham, the last word to you.
I think Lena's last word was a pretty good one. And along that vein, I think it's important to know what the certificate is for, know its role within your system. Is it giving students that access to higher education? Is it used with a competitive placement, rank order of students? Is it recognizing a breadth of skills so they can enter the labour market? Really important to know what the certificate is for, so that the assessments you design can be in line with that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for watching. It's been a pleasure for you joining us. And if you want to learn more about this report and the discussion topic, then check out the theory and practice of upper secondary certification. It's on the OECD website now, oecd.org. Get your reading glasses on. Thanks to the production team behind the scenes, led by Kevin Gillespie. Thanks to all of you for sending in your questions and comments. And thanks to all our panelists. Please do join us again for another OECD webinar soon. All the best.